Hello, Brantford. My name is Robert Williams. I'm part of the consultant team on this review for the City of Brantford, the one with the big long title called City Council Governance and Employment Status Review and the Ward Boundary Review. And this is phase one of that. I'll be joined later in this video discussion by David Siegel, who's another member of the consultant team. This particular video is talking about the size of council in Brantford. How many councillors should serve on Brantford City Council? There are some issues, of course, around how you can participate, because the whole point of this phase of activity is to bring your comments to our attention, your perspectives on how Brantford is structured, and the questions that we need to address are very much improved by the kinds of information and perspectives that you bring to it. So there are some directions on the screen, 4 different ways for you to provide comments to us through LetsTalkBrantford.ca, which has references to background research reports and other relevant materials, a public survey that we would like you to take and to make sure your friends and neighbors know about, opportunities to ask some questions, and then to join in a conversation through Let's Talk Brantford Forum. Again, all of that on that site. You could send direct messages to the clerk's office through the email there. You could mail a letter. You could even call the city between 8:30 and 4:30 in the day, and a customer service representative will be ready to help you either work through those materials or to answer questions you've got. So let's just move on then to talk a little bit about the size of council. The big question: how many councillors should serve on Brantford City Council? And the related question, and they are intertwined, because answering a couple of them really answers the third one. How many councillors are there? Should they be? How many should be elected in each ward? And how many wards should the city be divided into? Those are obviously interrelated, and for the purpose of this discussion, we're going to try to deal with them separately, but it's pretty clear that answering a couple of them will lead to the answer to the third, but they clearly have some significance for one another. So there are questions about the absolute size of Brantford Council, and we made a reference in the previous couple of slides to a discussion paper, background information research, where we talk about a larger council versus a smaller council. We need to be clear that in Ontario, there are no rules about how big a council can be, as long as it has 5 members. That's the minimum size. A mayor and 4 councillors. Brantford has a mayor and 10 councillors. And there is some concern that a council of that size has certain implications. One, the advantages. If you have more councillors, there should be increased citizen access. There are more of them to contact. It creates the possibility of increased diversity when there are more councillors elected to serve. On the other hand, it could create more complicated and slower decision making. If everybody feels the need to jump in on every question, meetings can be quite long, and the process of reaching a decision could be more difficult with that many voices to hear. It's also a more expensive process. It's not a major expenditure in the city's overall budget, but the more councillors there are, the more they are need to be supported, because they do work pretty hard, and there are other things related to helping them do their job. On the other side, a smaller council may decrease citizen access. There are fewer ears to reach, fewer eyes to read your messages when there are fewer of them there. There's a greater possibility of, if you will, homogeneity in the council. The diversity may be more difficult if it's a smaller number of councillors. For some people, though, a smaller council is simpler to operate. It can get to decisions more quickly than a larger council, and so that is some advantage, rather than spending hours and hours and making decisions late at night because the meeting is run on. There are also, of course, some reduced costs if there are not as many councillors. The trade-off there, of course, is that if there are fewer of them, the workload is shared among fewer members. So again, these are not black and white choices. They are a blend of things that need to be taken into account when looking at the size of council. So we've done a bit of research and checked around Ontario. Brantford is considered a single-tier municipality. That is, it's not part of a county, it's not part of a region. It is a municipality that has all the responsibilities of a council. And there are a number of them in Ontario that fall in roughly the same population range. And what we see from this is that Brantford is very much in the middle of the pack, if not slightly on the lower end of the size of councils. Chatham-Kent is at the top end, but that's an amalgamated community from the late 1990s. 10 or 12 is a fairly typical number. Kawartha Lakes is a bit on the smaller side, but again, its population is smaller. So Brantford is not an outlier in any of this, but the choice of adjusting council would leave it within that same general range. So how many councillors should serve on Brantford City Council is a question we are trying to address in here, and we welcome your feedback. I'm going to ask David Siegel to pick up the discussion at this point.
Thanks, Robert. I mean, the overall number of councillors is very important, but the other question is, how many councillors should there be per ward? The map that you're looking at right now shows the ward structure that Brantford has had for a considerable period of time. 5 wards, 2 members from each ward. As Robert indicated, we've made some comparisons with other municipalities and single-tier municipalities similar in size and other characteristics to Brantford. And what you see there is that municipalities are almost evenly split between 1 councillor per ward or 2 councillors per ward. So Brantford having 2 members per ward is not an unusual situation, but this is a time when we can consider whether it should be changed. There are certain positive and negative aspects to the idea of the 2-member wards. It's a good thing. 2-member wards are a good thing because the fact that you have more than 1 councillor means that there's likely to be 1 councillor available, even if one of the councillors is away and can't be reached. It also increases the chance that a constituent will find a councillor with a sympathetic ear, a councillor who will understand and sympathize with the concern of the constituent. There are some negative sides to 2 members per ward. It increases the size of council, and that gets into the issue that Robert was talking about. If you have a larger council, there are certain negatives associated with having a larger council. It also increases the size of wards, and that makes it more difficult for councillors to really understand the nature of their wards. And it also means that wards are less homogeneous. They're not really small communities. They're much larger areas. And finally, it can sometimes, the 2 members per ward can sometimes cause confusion. As a resident, which councillor do I approach? If I approach both of them, am I sort of doubling the workload on councillors? If councillors then take my concern to city staff, does that double and confuse the workload of city staff dealing with these? So that leads us to the second question in the triumvirate that Robert was talking about earlier, and that is, how many councillors should be elected from each ward? Do we stick with the status quo for Brantford, which has been 2 councillors per ward, or do we change it to a different number? As Robert said, once you've made a decision about these 2 first things that we've talked about, you've really determined the next item, which is the number of wards. But let's talk a bit about what happens with changes in the number of wards. Brantford has had those 5 wards for a considerable period of time, but this is a time when that could be changed if we wanted to. When you have a small number of wards, obviously the size of the wards are larger, and that increases the diversity within the wards. What that means is that larger wards are not going to have the same homogeneity. They're not going to have the same sense of community that smaller wards have. Larger wards also decrease the access that residents are going to have to councillors. Councillors represent a larger number of residents, meaning that they're just not going to be as readily available. And because of the size of the ward, it might also mean that councillors just don't understand some of the really detailed aspects of what's going on in their ward. Now, a smaller number of wards will also decrease the size of council. And again, Robert gave you perspective on that, the pros and cons of having a smaller council. And it's also more difficult for councillors to be familiar with their ward. A larger number of wards means that the wards are going to be smaller, they're going to be more homogeneous, which means that residents will have easier access to councillors because councillors will be serving a smaller number of residents. On the other hand, this is going to increase the size of council with the consequences that Robert mentioned earlier, but it also makes it easier for councillors to become familiar with their entire ward. So the third interrelated question then is, how many wards do we want the City of Brantford to be divided into? So those are the three questions that we need you to think about at this point. The size of council, the number of representatives per ward, and the number of wards. As we emphasized earlier, we want your feedback. In order to do our job properly, you need to tell us how you feel. There is another video in this series called "We Want to Hear from You," which explains in more detail exactly what the public participation process is. But the information you're looking on that slide right now gives you the information about how to leave information with the City of Brantford about your feeling on this issue. There's a survey that you can take. You can also leave your comments on there and see what other people have had to say by simply looking at the information that's provided on this slide. Will take you to the public participation aspects of this project. So this wraps up these three interrelated questions about the size of council, number of councillors per ward, and the number of wards. The next thing that we need to talk about is, what is the appropriate role of councillors? Should they be part-time as they have been in the past? Or should we have expectations that they'll be able to take this on as a full-time role and be paid accordingly? And my colleague Robert Williams is going to talk about that in the next slide in this series, which is labeled Role of Councillors.